Hello, everybody. Welcome to this short training on capturing chronic homeless status in a client's HMIS record. I'm Karen de Blasio, a Division Director of the Program Coordination and Analysis Division here in the SNAPS office. And I'm joined by Abby Miller, our HMIS lead here in the SNAPS office. Abby, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Karen. And thank you all for watching us today. I'm really happy to be doing the training with Karen today and to be diving into the HMIS work for SNAPS.
So before we begin, I want to take a minute and go over a couple of concepts interrelated. It's important to understand that there are these three separate concepts, but related concepts at play when we talk about how HMIS can be used to assist in identifying people who are experiencing chronic homelessness. This webinar is intended to help COCs and HMIS lead agencies understand the fundamental distinction between these concepts and to provide information that can be woven into appropriate provider and user training. So this particular webinar will cover capturing a client's chronic homeless status in their HMIS record according to the client's self-report at project entry. The other key concepts, as you can see here on the slides, are using your HMIS to document a client's chronic homeless status for eligibility purposes. So to do this, you would need to look at a client's HMIS enrollment records rather than the self-reported data on length of time homeless that's collected at each project entry. This documentation activity is only necessary for those projects with chronic homelessness as an enrollment criterion. The third block you see on the slide, reporting, combines these two concepts by looking at self-reported data and enrollment histories for each client so that we can run local and HUD-required reports to determine whether the person meets the definition of chronic homelessness at entry, at a point in time, or over the course of a year. So again, today, we're going to be focused on the first of these concepts. HUD will provide separate webinars related to the other concepts later on. So the learning objectives for today, we hope that at the end of this brief presentation, you'll be able to understand the data elements in the HMIS that must be captured in order to calculate chronic homelessness, understand the new combined data element 3.917, living situation, and become familiar with available tools and products about the HMIS data standards. So again, this presentation is intended to provide more detail on how to use your HMIS to record information required at every project entry. Capturing these data on every client is required by HUD and is necessary to later be able to run reports and create by-name lists of people who are experiencing chronic homelessness in your HMIS participating projects. So this webinar will not be an overview of the data standards changes or the final rule defining chronic homelessness. So there are several data elements that are required by HUD to be collected at every project participating in the HMIS. These are the universal data elements. Some are collected once for each client and carried through the system, while others are collected at each project entry. However, only 2 of those are relevant for determining a client's chronic homeless status for reporting purposes. These elements are disabling condition and living situation. This presentation will be an in-depth review of each of these elements and their subparts, for which I'm going to turn it over to Abby to walk us through.
Thanks, Karen. We're going to start with disabling condition, which is data element 3.8 in the HMIS Data Standards Manual and Dictionary. The universal data element disabling condition simply asks providers to indicate whether the client has a disabling condition, yes or no. And a disabling condition is defined as a physical, mental, or emotional impairment, including one caused by alcohol or drug abuse, PTSD, or brain injury, that 1 is long-continuing or indefinite, 2 impedes ability to live independently, and 3 could be improved by suitable housing, or a developmental disability or AIDS or any condition arising from HIV. In this data element 3.8, projects simply indicate yes or no as to whether a client reports that he or she meets these criteria. Some projects, depending on their funding requirements, may also have to answer more detailed questions about individual types of disabilities. It includes physical disability, developmental disability, chronic health conditions, HIV/AIDS, mental health problems, and substance abuse problems. If a client has one of these specific disabilities and the project indicates in the HMIS record that it's a long-continuing issue that substantially impairs the client's ability to live independently, then that also counts as a client having a disabling condition. But again, these are more detailed detailed data elements, and they're not necessarily required by every single project in the continuum, like 3.8 is. The more complex data element, and the one we're going to spend quite a bit more time on today, is one that was introduced in 2014 as data element 3.17. But it's been updated several times since then and is currently known as data element 3.917 in the data standards, or living situation. This data element has 5 separate fields, as shown here on the slide, and functions differently depending on whether a client's entering a project type that means they are currently homeless, that is an outreach, a shelter, or safe haven project, or they're entering a residential or other project type where they're not necessarily currently literally homeless, and so we treat each of those differently. We'll start with an overview of the 5 fields and then discuss how the structure is different for each of those project types. So first, we have type of living situation. Here, you want to talk to the client about the type of place the client was staying just before they came to your project. Select the best match from a list of the homeless, institutional, permanent, and other types of situations that are available to you. Second, you want to find out how long the client was staying in that situation. So if the client was in shelter for the last 2 weeks, you select 1 week or more, but less than 1 month from the options that are provided to you in the HMIS. Now, if the client is entering a project type other than shelter, safe haven, or outreach, there are some extra fields here. If the client is coming from a permanent or transitional housing situation that they were in for less than 7 days, or if they're in an institutional situation that they were in for less than 90 days, you're going to have to work with the client to figure out where they were before that. If it was on the street, in an emergency shelter, or in a safe haven, you'd indicate that in this field. If the client was in one of those 3 situations, you keep going. If not, you stop at that point. So the third field then is the date the client's literal homelessness experience started. So this would look back further than what you collected in that second field to cover any continuous time, either on the streets, shelter, or safe haven. So if the client had been staying in a shelter for 2 weeks, but had been on the street before that for a year, you ask the client if they remember when they first started living on the street. And you might then have to ask the client where they were staying before that to confirm that it was a place where they wouldn't be considered literally homeless. And once you get clear on that date or approximate date that the client became literally homeless this time, you enter that date in this field. So if the client became homeless today, you would indicate today's date. Fourth, we want to understand how many different times a client has been in literally homeless situations over the past 3 years. So you want to work with the client to think about breaks. In other words, breaks are those times that they were in permanent or transitional housing for a week or more, or in jail or other institutions for 3 months or more, the 90-day break. Once you and the client figure out how many breaks there have been in the past 3 years, you can add up the number of times the client was homeless between the breaks. Finally, the last question asks you to work with the client to look back over the last 3 years, and then you want to count up the total number of cumulative months the client was in a literally homeless situation. And you can round up on the current month. So if the client tells you they were homeless in January and February, and it's now March 10th, for instance, you can include March for a total of 3. Karen, that was a lot. Is there anything that you want to add to that?
Yeah, there is. Thanks, Abby. So we want to stress that each of these fields is here to capture self-reported data. And we understand that different project types may have different realities that they're working in when it comes to interviewing clients. So some high-volume shelters are going to need to simply ask people to tell them how many times they've been homeless and to ballpark how many months total. Other projects are going to have a more complex intake process that may allow their case managers to sit with the client and get a clear picture of official breaks in homelessness according to the definition of chronic homelessness. Permanent supportive housing projects with documentation requirements are going to be spending time with clients' HMIS records and files to get information for documentation purposes, which they can then use to improve data quality in this field. So all of these strategies are perfectly fine. We expect that the data quality will vary from project type to project type. This field is simply meant to provide a consistent way to capture information in the HMIS so COCs can actually start to use it for planning purposes.
Thanks, Karen. Those are really important points that different project types are going to have to handle this differently. So now that you understand what the fields mean, I'm going to talk about the structure of the questions that you might ask a client to gather information and walk through two examples, talking about our hypothetical person, John, and his housing for the last 3 years. So we'll start with John entering a shelter on October 10th, 2017. He's entering the shelter from a stay out on the streets, so the response for field 1 will be place not meant for human habitation. He remembers that he started staying on the streets at the end of last winter, thinks it was around May of 2017 or about 5 months ago. So the response for field 2 is 90 days or more, but less than 1 year. After a brief discussion and a quick glance at his HMIS records, the caseworker talking with John confirms that he was staying in an emergency shelter all through last winter. Before that, he was staying in a rental apartment with a few roommates. And John remembers that his roommates kicked him out last November, right after Thanksgiving of 2016. So in field 3, the case manager records that he's been on the streets or in a shelter since November 25th, 2016. The case manager discusses with John whether he'd stayed in a shelter or on the streets any other times in the last 3 years. There's no record of any other enrollments in the system, but John does recall that he stayed in a shelter in another state for 3 months in 2015. That was the only time other than this current occasion, so the response to field 4 is 2 times. Counting up the months over the 2 occasions, there are 3 months from 2015, combined with this occasion's approximate 11 months and 3 days. That includes the 3 days from November 2016, and then the whole current month of October 2017. So that adds up to the response in field 5, which is 12 or more months. For all other project types, the data element is set up to only collect responses to fields in certain circumstances. So for example, if John moves on from the shelter and enters into a PSH project on January 15th of 2018, the response for field 1 at the time of that PSH enrollment is emergency shelter. The case manager can see his record of his prior stay in an emergency shelter and confirms with John that he did enter the shelter on October 10th of 2017. That was just over 90 days ago, and so the response is 90 days or more, but less than 1 year. He was coming from a homeless situation, that is, the emergency shelter, so we bypass these next questions. If he was coming from a long stay in an institution or a permanent or transitional situation, he wouldn't be considered chronically homeless at project start, nor would he be able to age into chronic homelessness while in the transitional housing project. So further data collection would not be necessary for this data element. If he'd come from a short stint in an institution or just a few nights in permanent housing, the data element has a series of questions to determine if the client was in a literal homeless situation just before that, since those short stays don't count as breaks in literal homelessness. But John has been continuously on the streets or in a shelter for the last 14 and a half months, so we continue with the questions. Using the Thanksgiving holiday as a marker, the PSH project is able to pinpoint the last date he slept in a permanent housing situation for 7 nights or more and completes field 3. As before, his only other experience of homelessness was that 3-month stay in a shelter in 2015. So therefore, he's been on the streets or in a shelter a total of 2 times in the past 3 years, for a cumulative total of 17 and a half months. Now there's one additional consideration in completing this data element, and that's the inclusion of the previous living situation labeled interim housing. This is a special response category that's used only in certain circumstances. Where it's been determined to be absolutely necessary to use transitional or rapid rehousing to keep the client engaged prior to moving into PSH, the client must be identified as coming from interim housing to preserve that person's chronic identification in reporting. The client must have applied for the housing, been accepted into the housing project or voucher program, and have a unit or voucher reserved. For example, the unit may be awaiting a tenant moving out, or it could require repairs or painting, or the client has a voucher but is looking for a unit. Using the interim housing designation is not a substitute for a waiting list or for any situation other than what we've identified here. Now, hopefully those two examples of John moving through the system broke down 3917 in a way that helps you. We know that this is complicated, so feel free to move the cursor back, rewind it, and watch it again. But at this point, I'm going to turn it back to Karen to finish us out and talk about some of the resources we have available for you.
So thanks, Abby. So as Abby just said, 3.917 is a challenging data element. We recognize that. It's really, really important, but it is also challenging, particularly for certain project types that may have a lot of clients and have a lot of case management and work to do with clients. So we've put together some resources specific for you all for 3.917. One thing it is important to note is that vendors are expected to have the data element programmed in such a way, or have these pathways or dependencies programmed, so that you all and your staff are assisted in navigating the complexities of the data element. So it looks kind of very clunky on paper and when we're walking through it, but part of the reason we had Abby go through the data element and do the examples that she did was to kind of give you the flow of, you're only getting questions, there are dependencies, you're only getting questions based on answers, in some cases, to previous questions. So your system should be programmed to reflect those dependencies. We've also, in order to help you all and your staff understand the data collection process for this particular element, we've developed paper data collection forms for each project type. So for outreach, shelter, safe havens, and all the other project types. So the forms are available at the hyperlink shown on the page. There are forms for the universal data elements plus 2 supplemental forms specific to data element 3.917. The forms are called the Street Outreach Emergency Shelter and Safe Haven Project Supplement and the Transitional Housing, Permanent Housing, and Other Supplement. So they're provided in Word. That hopefully will allow you to incorporate them into your own local forms. I will just add, though, that HUD has been encouraging folks for a while to try to move as much as possible to real-time data entry. We know that that's not always possible and that some communities like to have these forms available for cases where real-time data entry is not possible, so that's why we're making this resource available. So to close it all out, I'd like to just go over a couple of data standards resources and core materials that we have available. And we thought that putting these all on one slide would be helpful so you could kind of have a list of all of the existing materials in the place. So hopefully you're familiar with these. If not, we encourage you to check these materials out. We are going to continue to add materials on the data standards and some of the trickier data elements. And as we said, we will be releasing more of these brief webinars around reporting and documenting chronic homelessness in your HMIS. So I want to thank everybody for joining us today. Hopefully this was helpful, and thank you for all the good work you're doing in our communities with our most vulnerable citizens.